I'm Casey Cannon. I'm a Master of Science student at West Liberty University, expected to graduate in fall 2024. And I'm doing my project on Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas, or Cyclura lewisi. The genus Cyclura is a group of large herbivorous lizards, which are part of the Iguanidae family. This genus is only endemic to islands in the northern Caribbean Sea. Each species appears to have a pretty small founder population. The most likely way that they reach these islands is via island hopping after hurricanes would wash out debris and baby lizards to sea. On several islands where they're found, they are the largest endemic land animal, and that is the case for the Grand Cayman blue iguana, which are the largest endemic animal on Grand Cayman Island. The genus relies heavily on visual communication. So you can see in all of these pictures we have males in their breeding colors. This is a rhinoceros iguana. You can see his large rhinoceros-style horns on his nose. This is a little Cayman iguana. He has more of a striping pattern and the red eyes, which many Cyclura seem to get during mating season. And I don't remember the common name of this, but I know they are a Riley, and you can see they have the very bright orange stripes on the blue background coloration. And in Cyclura, many species are adapted for environments which are almost arid, which is something you would not think about in the Caribbean Sea, but many of the islands that they've fallen onto don't have standing water. This is the Grand Cayman blue iguana, or Cyclura lewisi. They are endemic only to Grand Cayman Island, and is the island's largest endemic land animal. A large male can reach 1.5 meters and can weigh as much as 14 kilograms. The name comes from the blue coloration that the males will get during breeding season. You can see this boy right here is very much in blue. This is a female down here, and she's much more drab. And these are babies, and they're born with a more mottled brownish type of coloration. They are listed by ICUN as endangered. They are protected by the American U.S. Endangered Species Act as of 1983, and they are managed under the AZA's Cyclura SSP program as a yellow SSP. They are also managed under CITES as a CITES 1 species. All species of Cyclura are generalist herbivores. They eat a wide variety of leaves, shoots, fruits, and flowers. They will occasionally eat animal matter and occasionally eat fungi, but primarily they are eating plant matter. Cyclura have large colons, which is a physical property that many species of fully herbivorous iguanids have. It helps them digest plant matter. A study of Cyclura in the Dominican Republic revealed a preference for these type of plants. I'm not going to write out the names, but these two top species are species of cactus, and these down here are species of both fruiting and flowering plants. So they are able to eat cactus, which help them a lot in some of these very hot and dry areas where they live. And Cyclura are the largest terrestrial herbivores native to all of their ranges. There are no ungulates on any of these islands. There's nothing like that. So they are the only large herbivores on several of these islands. And with that, they are very important seed dispersers on the islands where they are native to. So some interesting facts about this species. Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas are very long-lived reptiles. The oldest recorded animal was estimated to be 69 years old. He was an adult male named Godzilla who was captured as an adult, estimated to be around 15 years old, in 1950, and he died at a breeding facility in 2004. It is illegal to keep this species in the United States in the pet trade, but hybrids are legally kept. So these two animals down here are hybrids. You can say they look a little bit different than this pure example, and they have a little bit longer faces and much more distinct striping. And the last fact is Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas were temporarily extinct in the wild from 2003 to 2005. when the last 24 wild examples were brought into captivity for breeding. And I guess another fact about this area is it is owned by the British government, so King Charles has a vested interest in keeping them alive. So broad taxonomy on this genus. They are part of the class Reptilia, the order Squamata, the family Iguanidae, and of course the genus Cyclura. So with Cyclura, the ICUN currently recognizes 10 extant species and 12 subspecies within those species. There is also one recently extinct species of this group. As far as the family Iguanidae goes, Cyclura are fairly basal in that group. You can see that they split off a little bit after the Fiji Island iguanas, but before the mainland iguana and chuckwalla species. So they're one of the more basal species within this group. So looking at them being a more basal member of the Iguanidae family, it is estimated that Cyclura split from the mainland iguanas around 14.6 million years ago. And we will go up a little bit further into the actual Grand Cayman Island blue iguana taxonomy, which is considered to be a bit messy by some taxonomists. Taxonomists consider them to be a subspecies of the rock iguanas, Cyclura nubilia, until 2004 when a paper split them. The paper that split them cited more color and evolutionary trajectory reasons for the split instead of a standard scalation and structure. More recent genetic testing has revealed that this species may not be as valid as some would like for it to be. You can see it's pretty clearly in the western group of the Cyclura nubilia group in Cuba. But what's interesting is they are fairly distinct from Little Cayman, which are their closest by distance relatives. But their closest by genetics relatives seem to be animals on the western side of Cuba. Now this is the native range of all members of the Cyclura genus. So all 10 species and 12 subspecies are found throughout this range in the northern Caribbean Sea. I showed the entire map here because this is going to be important when I start talking about invasive species to show that Cyclura do not live anywhere on the mainland and none of their potential predators live on these islands. This is Grand Cayman Island. It is the entire native range of the Grand Cayman blue iguana. The island itself is fairly small. It is 196 kilometers squared, which is about 70% of Ohio County, West Virginia, where, for us online students who had to look it up, is where West Liberty is located. So this island itself, and the entire range of this species, is smaller than the county where West Liberty is located at. And unfortunately, on this island right now, there are 3 spots where this species has been reintroduced. This is Queen Elizabeth Botanical Gardens, Selenia Park, and Kohler Park. And all of these places are fenced off from any potential predators, protected from any potential development, but that is the only 3 places on the planet where this species is living in the wild currently. Being a species from such a small geographic area, you can imagine that any development is going to hurt the species exponentially compared to development on the mainland. For instance, if you have 20 square kilometers on this island that are developed, you just took away 10% of this animal's entire native range. And on the Caribbean, that is very common to happen because we build resorts. So the native range and the native habitat of this species, they are called rock iguanas for a reason. It is mostly a limestone field covered in shrubby, semi-arid adapted vegetation. So you can see this plant right here is a large yucca-like plant. You have a lot of species that are adapted for water with high salinity, like palm trees and some of these coastal shrubs. And of course, large rockways, so the animals can climb up and down and defend their territory. They do quite a bit of digging, so what will happen is a female will come in to an area and she will build a nest or a burrow, and a male will cover large tracts of land that usually covers multiple females. So you have something of a harem type situation with this species, where the females will fiercely guard their land and one or two males will have territories that overlap with these females, and that's how they mate. Now we're going to start talking about the reasons for impairment in the Grand Cayman Island blue iguana. As previously discussed, Grand Cayman Island itself is only 196 kilometers squared, which means any development on this island represents a very large percentage of potential habitat loss for this species and every other species native to this island. And this is a problem for many cyclura. Most cyclura populations, native ranges, are on small Caribbean islands. All of these islands were historically impacted by European colonization, and in modern times, most are subject to high population growth and international tourism industry. Grand Cayman Island is known as a premier tourist destination, cruise ship port, and international banking haven. It is a very attractive place to live for very wealthy people who can afford to buy large tracts of land and develop them into resorts. So, population growth has been nearly exponential since the 1950s. In 1951, the population was approximately 7,300 people, and by 2024, it has grown to around 70,000 people. Again, on an island that only has 196 square kilometers. You can see in this picture right here where there is new construction for a new resort, and behind it you can see all of the houses, all the hotels, all the Airbnbs, all the restaurants that have just completely destroyed the habitat for so many species in this area. Only around 11% of Grand Cayman Island is protected from development, and most of this is mangrove swamps where the blue iguanas don't live. Only around 1% of the historic dry forest land is protected, and the government is actively encouraging human development projects across most of the Grand Cayman Islands. The government, of course, wants the money coming in from the tourism industry. They want to keep the rich people who want to hide the money in Grand Cayman banks to be happy. So the iguanas and all of the native species are unfortunately taking a backseat to how much money this place brings in. I did not discuss this on the previous slide, but the entire extent of the range of the Grand Cayman Island blue iguana in modern times is only about 15.6 kilometers squared. So less than 10% of the entire island is left behind for the Grand Cayman Island blue iguana. So furthering with human development brings roads, which brings cars. And for an animal that naturally wants to go onto rocky surfaces on the ground and stay there for long periods of time, a road or sidewalk is very attractive to them. So they have a habit of going off onto roadways and sitting there to bask and being hit by cars. So it is believed that car collisions were the major cause of death for the last remaining adult blue iguanas on the islands. The wild numbers had dropped between 150 to 200 in 1995 to fewer than 20 in the wild in 2003. Roadkill was cited as being one of, if not the major contributing factor in the last of these animals. And as you can see right here, it still happens today because there was a juvenile blue iguana that was seen hit by a car not too long ago. So like many island species, Cyclura hyper-specialized for the island where they evolved on. Any changes on these islands, especially from things like human-disturbed settlements, are very difficult for them to adapt to. This makes room for a more habitat generalist invasive to come in this case the green iguana, to begin to take over their niche. So, green iguanas, iguana, are a fast-breeding habitat generalist which occupy the same niche of large herbivorous lizard as Cyclura. Green iguanas thrive in human-disturbed habitats in tropical areas and co-evolved with the mammalian predators because they are from the mainland on Central America. This species is found all over the world right now. You can find them in Miami, you can find them in Dubai, you can find them in Thailand. Almost anywhere they're let go where it doesn't get enough frost, this species is able to thrive and very quickly establish themselves and take over. Green iguanas reach these areas because they are an important food source for many Central American cultures. And during especially the 80s and 90s, they became very popular in the pet trade, and people began to let them go when they got large because green iguanas are a fairly large and fairly aggressive lizard that starts out pretty cute. That is how they reached Grand Cayman. Green iguanas were accidentally released on Grand Cayman in 1995 and quickly exploded in population because there were no competitors for them. The green iguanas, or the blue iguanas at this point, had nearly been wiped out, and people had changed the landscape by planting gardens, by digging pools, by having ponds, which these lizards just thrive in. So much so that the Grand Cayman government had to issue an eradication program for green iguanas in 2018. This resulted in 1.35 million green iguanas being removed. They had a bounty program for them where if you killed an iguana, you would be given money, and this went on until 2022. And for conservation of Cyclura species, it's difficult to convince locals that we need to save iguanas when there's iguanas everywhere and they're eating everything and they're pooping over everything and they're scaring your kids away from places by whipping their tails at your kids. So the presence of green iguanas has been shown to hurt the conservation efforts for Cyclura species because the population looks and says, I don't want to save iguanas, I hate iguanas, I see iguanas every day. So, another common problem for many island species, and Cyclura are no exception, are invasive predators that were brought on to the shores of these islands that never saw them before. So, if you remember the range map of Cyclura, which typically live right here, this is the range map of raccoons and coatis and their close relatives. So, other than a few places in the Bahamas where they had been recently introduced, there are none. So, none of the common North American predators and scavengers that you would see on the mainland are found on these islands, so no member of the Cyclura genus ever co-evolved with a mammalian predator. I've even heard it said that the only reason Florida does not have a Cyclura species is because raccoons were able to stop the ones that colonized, because you have to think, if they are going to wash up on the shore of Cuba, they have to have at some point washed up on the shore of Florida. So they just have no way of dealing with mammalian predators. When the European colonists started coming onto these islands, the second they docked their ships on the shores, nori rats and domestic cats ran off into the shores of the islands. As the islands began to become colonized with more permanent human settlements, they brought along things like domestic dogs and pigs. So, as you can see from this picture right here, domestic cats are able to make pretty quick work of a baby Cyclura. Domestic rats, or nori rats, are able to sniff out the nest of Cyclura because they don't dig their nest very deep. So, you would see a lot of times where a female would freshly lay eggs, and within a few days a rat would dig it up and kill all of them. Domestic dogs are one of the only animals that are capable of eating an adult Cyclura that is found on these islands. So you do see, on some of them, especially Cuba, you'll see crocodiles or large boids, which were capable of eating an adult Cyclura, but those animals don't eat anywhere near as often as a large mammal does. And not so much on Grand Cayman, but on Jamaica and on the Dominican Republic, they brought on species like mongoose to control the predator, or control the pest population on sugarcane plantations and other plantations which had been built on those islands. The introduction of these predators was devastating for all Cyclura populations, And currently on Grand Cayman Island, they can only exist on areas which had been fenced off and the predators had been eradicated. So now we're going to be talking about Grand Cayman Island blue iguana conservation. And you cannot talk about conservation in this species without talking about this man right here. This is Fred Burton, who was the founder of the BIC and was one of the original surveyors who found out this species was reduced to around 20 to 12 individuals in the late 1990s. Currently, there are around 450 breeding adult Cyclura lewisii on Grand Cayman Island. All of these living animals are descended from 24 founders, which were either captured from the wild in the early 2000s, or they had been in captivity before then as part of other breeding programs. Lucky for us, these animals are long-lived, so as of 2021, some of these founders are still alive and breeding, which helps a lot for things like genetic drift because you can't lose founder genetics if the founders are still alive and breeding. All of the founders on Grand Cayman Island were animals that were brought over to Queen Elizabeth II Botanical Park at the Blue Iguana Conservation Center there, or the BIC. The BIC captive breeds the blue iguanas and head starts the offspring for 1 to 2 years. In 2021, over 1,000 individuals had been released into the wild from this original founder group. Each offspring is given a medical exam and given a distinct tag, which you can't quite see in this picture, but this right here, it is a little piercing with distinct beads, so each one has a distinct bead pattern, which makes it much easier for you to take a picture and know which animal had been re-seen. And they are released onto one of 3 protected areas, the Queen Elizabeth II Botanical Park, the Salina Reserve, or Collars Wilderness Reserve. So now we're going to talk about Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas that are managed by the AZA. This species is kept by the AZA as part of a tag. As of July 2020, there were 65 Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas in 23 AZA accredited facilities. They are managed by the Cyclura SSP program and are kept as a yellow SSP. There is a stud book for them that the AZA manages. The original group of blue iguanas in the AZA care was from an initiative that started in 1990, where they took all of the extant blue iguanas in the United States from both private and public sector, so private keepers and zoos, to try to see how many we had. The AZA developed a genetic test to see which ones were pure and which ones were hybrid, because it had been previously, as had been previously discussed, this species does readily hybridize, especially with the Cuban rock iguanas, and the offspring often look quite a bit like Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas, and they are able to produce fertile offspring, so you can end up with animals that are very high percentage blue iguanas but are still hybrids, and they are not useful for conservation. The genetic testing found that almost all of the Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas in captivity were actually hybrids. They found that only 3.1 of the group was pure, and they were all siblings, which doesn't help much for a founding population of them at all. So the AZA partnered up with the BIC for bloodline exchanges, and a very big thing what the AZA does with conservation of the species is they help with fundraising and research programs for the BIC, who were really the main people in charge of conservation for this species. This partnership is considered to be a great success for this species, as well as an example for other conservation groups as cooperation between the AZA and groups for conservation outside of the United States. So as far as private keeping of the species, it's actually illegal in the United States to own a pure Cyclura lewisii. So there are groups that are working with hybrid lines, but that's mostly for the pet trade, and they are occasionally used as ambassador animals. The hybrids are legal to own, the pures are not, as we had previously said. However, you can own different species of Cyclura And the AZA does occasionally work with certain private individuals to help breed very rare endangered species, especially in the Florida area, where they breed very regularly outside. The most well-known of these facilities is Iguana Land, which is owned by this man, Ty Park. Iguana Land is in Punta Gorda, Florida. It is a privately owned zoo owned by Ty. This facility works with Fort Worth Zoo to breed the critically endangered Cyclura pinguis. And last time I spoke with Ty, which was in 2021, they were the only facility in the United States that had Cyclura pinguis. So the AZA trusted this private individual because he had such a large track record with being able to breed Cyclura iguanas outdoors in Florida, that they decided that instead of using their space for these large lizards, it'd be better to send them off to this private facility. So privately, you can't keep, but you can fundraise. And Iguana Land does that. They held an annual fundraising event called Iguana Fest, which has a goal of raising $250,000 for iguana, specifically Cyclura conservation. And some of that goes towards breeding and helping establish Cyclura lewisi back into the wild. So now we're going to discuss the genomics of the last remaining Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas. As we had previously discussed, the founding population of Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas were 24 individuals, which had either been captured from the wild or brought in from other captive sources before the early 2000s. So, all living Grand Cayman Island blue iguanas are either direct progeny of that founding population or the few remaining members of that founding population. The Blue Iguana Recovery Program was able to establish kinship within the group of the original founders to find out who was most closely related. They set up pairings for individuals with the least amount of kinship, and this is allowed for, even though there being a very small founding population, the inbreeding coefficient to be relatively small. Most years, the average inbreeding coefficient of the offspring is near zero. This did change one year where there were only 6 individuals born and it threw off the average, but you can look at this chart right here. Most of the inbreeding coefficients are found to be very, very close to zero. All of them are under 0.05. Most of them are under 0.01. The minimum viable population has been found to be 500 individuals. Current numbers far exceeds this. There's about 450 breeding adults, but there are also multiple juvenile animals which have been released into these habitats, which will eventually become breeding animals. So the population is much higher than the minimum viable population that would slow genetic drift. However, the population is out of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which means that some alleles are far overrepresented for what you would expect, and some alleles are far underrepresented. So there have been testing of 25 loci that shows 21 of them have significant deviations from the expected allele frequency. This is probably because certain members of the founding population were more successful at breeding than others, which would make their alleles overrepresented and the ones who were less successful underrepresented. Due to the nature of the release program, which has just been in the last 20 years, where we're still continually releasing animals from the wild, all 3 populations have very similar genetics, so they will take members of one clutch and release them into 3 different places so that there are the same, literally siblings are in all 3 populations, which means that there's not much difference in the meta population overall. There just haven't been enough generations born in the wild to have an effect on that yet. So a big fear in any population which had such a small founder stock, you have to worry about things like inbreeding depression and how much a lack of heterozygosity is going to affect the survivorship of the hatchlings. A study found that there was no significant difference in the heterozygosity between hatchling and adult age classes, which suggested there was no inbreeding depression affecting the survivorship in captivity. So animals which were more inbred or had less heterozygosity were just as likely to survive to adulthood as animals with higher heterozygosity. However, some founders were better breeders, and their genetics are overrepresented, which we had talked about with the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium being off in this population. They also have had worries that animals which have higher homozygosity are going to be less likely to survive in the wild, because that has been found in other captive breeding populations and captive breeding programs with release. A study found that in Salinia Reserve, there was significantly more recapture rates for animals with higher heterozygosity compared to the overall group which had been released, which does suggest that heterozygous animals are more likely to survive long-term to be recaptured in this park. However, a similar study was done in Queen Elizabeth Botanical Park and did not find any significant difference. It is possible that since Queen Elizabeth Botanical Park is more established and there is a better predator control in this park, that there's just not as many factors that would affect an animal with lower heterozygosity to survive compared to Salinia Park, which had been established much later and still has a few predators in it, which could allow for animals with more homozygosity to be attacked by predators. For my slogan, I chose support the grand recovery of the Grand Cayman blue iguana. It's a British-owned island, so I think the use of grand like that sounds very official and very Britishy. Plus, it kind of rolls off the tongue. It's a little cheesy, but I think a lot of conservation slogans are going to be very cheesy, so I think it works. And of course, these are my citations, so there they are.